Ooh, a new assignment. So, Shakespeare. Perhaps the most well-known writer in the English language, and you've probably had to pen a few essays on him in school. I mean, it is a spring ritual in the US where, at least according to Google Trends, every May students seem to frantically Google Romeo and Juliet. First I'll go over why Shakespeare is taught in the US school system, then how it is taught. Part 1. Why? Over a century after Shakespeare's death, US schools finally begun to teach his writing. But why was this? Well, back in the early 19th century, Shakespeare was pretty much considered pop culture, so it wasn't taught in the school system. Though, influential universities had literary societies, which were basically book clubs where rich white men argued about how schools should be taught. Everyone in these societies loved reading Shakespeare. So this one dude, who was an influential educator and literary society member, William McGuffey, decided to go ahead and teach Shakespeare in his classes. Initially, he taught short passages written by Shakespeare, which were often anonymous. It is important to note that these passages were read aloud and not analyzed as literature. Instead, they were taught with the intention of improving people's speaking skills. A shift to teaching Shakespeare was especially prevalent starting in the 1870s. Since as students became teachers, they began to pass down these passages to their students. But in the late 1800s, theater became more high class, so schools started to include longer passages and even the entirety of Shakespeare's plays. In essence, literary societies in the 19th century propelled the teaching of Shakespeare in the US school system, instead of the theater itself. And, though his plays are currently taught as a whole, they were initially instructed as anonymous passages for the purpose of rhetorical development. Part 2. How? Currently, Shakespeare is taught through an approach called new criticism. New criticism is basically just where you teach a text through close reading, focusing on the author as a sort of omniscient intelligence who carefully decides each word, instead of the human who wrote the book. This method originated from study of the Bible, where the people who wrote the Bible were thought of as separate from the words of God that the text conveyed. For example, when you're studying a book, it's not always the case that the writer themselves was consciously aware of every word, literary device, or aspect of the language. But when using new criticism, you write about the concept of the author as if they were. Conclusion. So, what's the point of all of this? Well, in examining the history of teaching Shakespeare, it is interesting to see how the systems of why and how it is taught seem to work in similar ways. On the side of why, actions of a few elites influence the school system as a whole, while on the side of how, the way in which the Bible was thought of impacted the way in which Shakespeare, who was in fact a person, is taught.